What is happening out there, Roto Scouts basketball fans? They thought we weren't going to get on for a show today. I sure did at one point during the afternoon. What a gigantic mess of a night, too, for the NBA. 12 games on deck, all kinds of moving parts, some news lingering. I feel like we're about to get the Karl Anthony Towns news. I saw a couple people kicking around maybe fake reports. Who knows what's going on there? Doesn't look like it's landed just yet, but that could be a tough spot that drops at the beginning of the show here. We are undoubtedly going to have news come out during the show that will change basically the entire nature of this slate, but we've got a few really sure things out here, most specifically on the DraftKings board. This is your Vegas total board. We'll hop over to the usual file, go through some sim results. What we're not going to do on this show probably is get too bogged down in discussing minutes, rotations. I'm keeping them as sharp as possible for the second night of the season with none of these teams having played yet on my end, and we'll get into debating more of who looks like they're getting two additional minutes, two fewer minutes as time goes on and we move forward through this. But right now, we're taking it as we've got it. We'll make any changes and updates as needed, but spent a lot of time getting this thing coordinated today, and hopefully we are pretty good to go. Successful first night, profitable first night, nothing crazy, but cashed a bunch of lineups. Really liking the FanDuel little 20 max that they're running. It's a $4 20 max. Nice little contest, kind of like the NFL contest they've been running, except it doesn't have 50K up top and it doesn't have a top 50% guaranteed payout, but still a good little contest. So I had some in that, did pretty well, and then I just had a couple in the big FanDuel contest. I'm just throwing darts at the lotto this year, but we'll see how we do there. But yeah, pretty good. And Anthony Taylor nails it in the chat. What's going on, Ant? DK, why did DK price PJ Washington at that price? I have no idea, but PJ not going to be, but absolutely should be 100% on. Total lock situation. PJ Washington, if you're not paying attention, is 3,000 on DraftKings today. It's about 2,500, 3,000 short of where he ought to be. Take full advantage. That's a free square. You do not want to skip that spot. You don't necessarily have to go 100%, but the field's going to be 75%. The field's sharp enough. So to take full advantage of that, you got to be above that by a pretty clear margin. So yeah, that's a crucial spot on DraftKings. We'll get to that in a second. Let me fly through this Vegas board. We're going to try and make as good time as possible. Let me mention a couple things though. For one, Cujo's here. Good afternoon, buddy. Beyond the Rabbit Holes here. Anthony Taylor's here. A couple other people hanging out. Say hello in the chat when you get a chance. If you're new here, or if you just don't have an active subscription right now, doesn't have to be your first ever subscription. Scrolling across the bottom of the screen, promo code WEEKFREE gets you a free week on a weekly plan. Your first week is free on a new weekly plan at Roto Scouts with promo code WEEKFREE. There's a bunch of them open right now. Take advantage. Get you access to NBA, MLB, NHL, and NFL, all four major sports going on through the World Series. So you get access to all of that for projections, for all the NFL content, and so on and so forth. So hopefully you guys jump in over at Roto Scouts. Everything is under $1 a day. That plan does renew after a week at the regular price. That's $6 and change, and you still get access to after that week. We'll see where the World Series is, but you'll at least have the three major sports going on alongside, and you get access to all of them for under $1 a day. I've seen other sites are running specials for $1 a day for one sport. We're always under $1 a day for all of the sports. Brooklyn Nets, Charlotte Hornets, ugly game, 5-point spread, 228.5 point total there. Hornets, maybe a couple interesting pieces, a 116.75 point total, not completely uninteresting as an implied team total. A grindy 215 point total between Orlando and Miami. Orlando favored by 8.5, should smoke Miami there. Not a lot of overly appealing parts. Knicks potentially missing Karl Anthony Towns, a couple other missing pieces there facing the Cavs, 1.5 point dogs at home in the Garden, 228.5 point total in that game. Both sides definitely appealing enough. There are go-to type players there in any situation, so we can get to both sides of that game, but it loses a little bit of its luster. 228.5 point total, though, is still appealing. If that had been on last night's, it would have been the highest of the three games. Toronto, Atlanta, 5.5 point spread there. 237 point total is very appealing. I believe that's our second highest total behind the Detroit-Chicago game at 237.5. If you look over to the right there, I've just got some average game high, game low, and the average implied totals, the implied high and the implied low laid out there for you. So yeah, Toronto, Atlanta, very appealing. 116.5, 116 on the Toronto side, 121.25 on the Atlanta side. That is your implied team high for the day. A lot of interesting pieces on that Atlanta team. Philly coming into Boston, 4.5-point spread there. Different looking Boston squad. For my money, it's best for Boston to just punt this season with no Tatum for the season and try and get a high-end draft pick to add to that unit that they've got to bring back next year. But Boston coming in, opening up as 4.5-point dogs against Philly, who does have Joel Embiid at a pretty affordable price. 112.25 on the Philly side of that one, 116.75 on the Boston side. New Orleans at Memphis, a 4-point spread in Memphis' favor at home, a 236-point total. Definitely interesting there already with Memphis. A lot of missing pieces. As usual, that team's just made of glass. It's really annoying to have to deal with that squad all the time, but they do come in at pretty high totals most of the time. And then they're playing a New Orleans team that's got a really appealing Zion Williamson up at the top of the board, looking pretty solid, and some other moving parts. Washington at Milwaukee. We've got Giannis to work with there. It's a 10-point spread. I don't know how much more we're getting to beyond Giannis, and I don't know how much of him we'll end up with, but a 10-pointer, 227-point game puts that solidly in the middle. A little bit of blowout risk there with Washington being pretty bad. Detroit at Chicago. Again, a very appealing game, just a 2.5-point spread, 120, 117.5 across sites on that one. 237.5 leads your slate. Definitely some usable parts in that game. LA at Utah. The Clippers at Utah, 9.5 points favorite on the road against probably the worst team in basketball. 226-point total there. Definitely some blowout risk at the top end for the Clippers around some of just those aged veterans, but they look very, very solid for points per minute output for whatever we're going to get out of them. Utah side, mix and matchy. San Antonio and Dallas, 2.5-point spread there. Obviously, we mentioned PJ Washington already. Looks really appealing. Definitely some usable parts on both sides of that game beyond him, though. We'll get into that one a little bit, I'm sure. Minnesota at Portland. A couple guys for some reason didn't come through the sim from the Portland side. I think the ownership just went in at 0 for that game. It was probably getting updated from the third party I get it from, but nothing really to sweat there. 221.5-point total. Kind of an ugly game. A little bit grindy and defensive. That Portland team should be pretty good defensively this year, and Minnesota brings that pace down, and they're a fairly good defensive unit as well. And then we end things with Sacramento against Phoenix. 229-point total. A reasonable end of the night type spot to look for some offense. There are usable pieces on the Sacto side. No Sabonis tonight, so there's a little bit of upside for some other of their players. It's not the most appealing game, but it's definitely not the least appealing, and it probably is the most appealing out of those last few games. Let me stop that, share this. And make that a little bit more visible for you guys. That kind of works. Do this. Is that better? Yeah, it's got to be better. All right, so as mentioned, just up at the top here, we've got some of those guys that either just didn't come through the sim for stupid naming reasons or because they're part of that Portland-Minnesota game. Not a single one of them is overly relevant. Like if you look over at the FanDuel side, we got like one share of Drew Holiday, we got one share of Rudy Gobert, and they're not all that dissimilar on the DraftKings board. They're actually higher priced on DK for Gobert. Higher price for Drew Holiday. So I can't imagine we'd be getting them over here had they come through properly. And then just a handful of guys that are all projected under 5 fantasy points. So I'm going to do this just for sanity's sake and just get all of these guys out of the file here. I just wanted to leave them there so I could show you guys that I was doing that as we start our conversation here. Let me go through some insy outsies real quick. I'll read those to you. Let me double check that we haven't gotten any updates. No, Cooper Flagg expected to start. We knew that. John Morant expected to play. No minutes restriction. Dante DiVincenzo starting ahead of Mike Conley. I nudged 2 minutes in DiVincenzo's favor just before the show started. That update is not accounted for in what we're going to talk about here. I don't think it's going to be overly impactful. Otherwise, everything is listed in your projections board. Starting at the probables, OG Anunoby, Nikola Jovic is available, Terry Rozier is available, Jalen Suggs is available, Karis LeVert, Will Riley is available, Karis LeVert's probable, Giannis is probable, Kobe Sanders is available, Ace Bailey is available, Rocco Zikarsky is available to do some bricklaying at your house, and Grayson Allen is probable. Questionables, Danny Wolf, DeAndre Hunter, Karl Anthony Towns, Khalil Ware, Jaylen Brown, and Anthony Edwards. Some pretty significant names there. And then a long list of outs. Haywood Highsmith, Josh Green, Grant Williams, Darius Garland, Max Strus, Josh Hart, Mitch Robinson, Tyler Hero, Kasparis Jakunis, close enough, Mo Wagner, Paul George, Jared McCain, Trenton Watford, Jason Tatum, Colin Murray, Boyles, Jacoby Walter, Jaden Ivey, Marcus Sasser, Zach Collins, Kobe White, Kevon Looney, Carlo Makovich, DeJounte Murray, Brandon Clark, Zach Edey, Ty Jerome, Scottie Pippen, Vince Williams Jr. That's all your Memphis guys. Balak Coulibaly, Jordan Miller, Jamil Telford, Isaiah Collier, George Niang, De'Aaron Fox, Kelly Olynyk, Jeremy Sohan, Lindy Waters, Dante Exum, Daniel Gafford is doubtful, Kyrie Irving is out, Scoot Henderson, Damian Lillard, Robert Williams III are all out for Portland, Isaac Jones, Keegan Murray, DeMontis Sabonis are all out for Sacramento, and Jalen Green is also out. This is the second night of the season and the opening night for all of these teams, and all of those guys are out, and a handful of key players are questionable. Welcome back to the NBA. Gotta love it. If you don't love it, you're probably me. I definitely don't love it. I love playing it. I love the sport. I love the NBA. But, man, we got to figure out some of this availability nonsense. There's got to be a better way. Top of the board overall, PJ Washington. PJ comes in at 6,100 on the FanDuel slate, power forward and small forward eligible, with nearly a 30-point projection, a 4.77 value score that is essentially meaningless and renders him fairly irrelevant on that board. He got into one share across the 150 lineups on the FanDuel slate. At 3,000 on DraftKings, he is in 97.3% of the top 150 lineups that we ran through the sim. You can see the difference. 9.77 might be opening night, our top value scorer that we see all season long. As a reminder, we're typically looking for 5.5 on DK, 5 on the FanDuel slate in terms of those value marks. If you're new, that's right here. This is laid out DK on the right where it's green, FanDuel on the left where it's blue, player info, stats just from last year over here. These are our exposures in that column and that column in the top 150 lineups across our sim. So just kind of give you a barometer of how much you want to be getting to these guys versus the field. And then these little arrows here are a measure against projected third-party ownership that I'm using as to where our number lands against the projected ownership for the field. So, for example, on Zion, at 78% exposed in our DraftKings lineup, 67% exposed in our FanDuel lineups, we are taking a massive share of Zion, and we're taking him out well ahead of the field. While he is very popular on both sites in that great spot against Memphis, we're getting way more of him. That's a really, really good looking spot as it's coming up in the sims, as it's projecting 5.77 for value, 5.50 for value on the FanDuel slate. Those are the top 2 DraftKings plays. If you're just here for, hey, who are the top 2 guys that I can start a lineup with? That's them. 3,000 for one, 8,900 for the other. It's essentially a free square on PJ Washington. Good luck. Godspeed. That's really your starting point. You could throw a $3,700 Bryce Sensabaugh into the mix, who we're getting a little bit. He's a 24-minute projection, but he's very, very cheap. It's another one. You can see that difference. 51 on FanDuel, small forward and shooting guard eligible over there. He got into no lineups. 37 on DraftKings. He's a 6+ value score. He got in nearly half, 46%. That's a little bit above the field. He's probably owned in like the mid-30s per these projections. But again, just radically different 12-game slates from site to site. Now that I've spun that up a little bit, let's get into some of the game by game. By the way, if and when we get that cat news, that's going to be a little bit slate changing because we were getting some cat. I've got him out in a nice projection in this spot. 22% above the field on FanDuel, 32% above the field on DraftKings. But if he comes off the board, that's going to create some value in a Porty spot. It's probably going to make Yabu look a little bit better than he does at 0% and 19% below the field for 3,800. He would become an interesting value play over there with the presumption of adding, a couple minutes to his 28 there, just for lack of a big man and him being the most talented guy that would be available in the big man role. So definitely a slate shaper if Cat comes off the board. Something to be aware of as we jump into guards and so on. Hit the like button as we get started here. Subscribe to the channel. Doesn't cost you anything to do those 2 things. Costs you very little to subscribe to the projections over at Roto Scouts. If you want to get behind the scenes for a week for free on a new weekly plan, you don't have to be a first-time subscriber. Promo code WEEKFREE gets you fully free access. MLB for the World Series, NFL for every main slate, every single game, except for those morning ones that I missed over in Europe. NHL for every main slate, and NBA for every single main slate. Cade looks pretty solid. 8% on FanDuel. Wouldn't mind having more Cade if I could figure out a way to get there. 4.97, just short of our value score. But when we're talking about Cade, we're looking at a guy in the top overall game total game and the top overall scorer in that game, 1.37 FanDuel points per minute. He's a difference maker. He's a potential ceiling trajectory player. So you can just take positions on guys like that where you're just planting a flag on Cade Cunningham Mountain. And if he's at 8%, we're only angled like that against the public ownership. That means he's going to be fairly low owned by the public. Wouldn't be backbreaking to get to a nice share ahead of the field. 9,900 on DraftKings, a little bit cheaper over there. 29% coming up at a 5.27 value score. Really looking pretty interesting. We're getting 28% of Trey Jones for just 4,000. A lot of value guys hitting the board. 5,200 on FanDuel. Yet another guy completely different across sites. That $1,200 price difference against the FanDuel cap, shooting guard and point guard doesn't even matter. He got into no lineups across 150 at a low 4.37 value. On DraftKings, he's in nearly 30% of our lineups. That's nicely above the field, not taking a gigantic position, but you can see it's angled up slightly. The field's probably 20-ish, 22%, somewhere in that territory. 5.6 value score puts him up over our threshold. That is exactly what we're looking for as just a cheap building block. He's not a ceiling guy. He's not a slate breaker, but 0.94 DraftKings points per minute, nearly 30% assist rate, 28.9% assist rate last year. That is a solid player. That's a reasonable option across 24 minutes as a value play in that high-end Detroit-Chicago game. Trey just looks like Trey. Pretty solid on DK at 27%. That's essentially level with the field, just shy of a 50-point projection. 131 per minute on the DK board last year. 9,800 definitely gets him into shares. You can take a larger position than that on Trey. 4.94 isn't exactly what we're looking for in terms of the value mark, but it definitely is an upside player, and it's a fairly upside game too. Keep in mind, again, that is right there with that Detroit-Chicago game as one of the more appealing spots just by Vegas game totals and numbers. On the FanDuel slate, Trey's only 9,000. That's 800 cheaper against the relatively higher FanDuel cap. 5.10 FanDuel's value score, aggressively over the field on FanDuel in the sim, 49% of our overall lineups. That is a major piece on the FanDuel board. We're getting a lot of Trey over there. And then we've got a bunch of, again, just completely different types. Back and forth. We had essentially no shares of a lot of these guys. We got 3% of Josh Giddey. We got 6% of Cam Thomas. Largely unimpactful players. I'm fine with taking Cam Thomas against Charlotte, sure, but only for a few shares like we got. Josh Giddey, sure, again, in that appealing game, the Detroit-Chicago game, sure. Good projection there, but only a 4.85 value, 4.99 value on Cam Thomas. Those guys are just essentially correctly priced. There's no real advantage to them on the FanDuel slate. They're not overly advantageous on the DraftKings board either, just 9% of each guy, but we got more of both guys on the DraftKings board. That is below the field on both, but reasonable enough that you could take a little bit of a position, level it out to 12% ownership or wherever the field is. Above those two guys, we got guys who are a little bit more involved for cheap pricing. $3,600 Najee Marshall, shooting guard and small forward eligible, landing at a 5.22 value score. Got into 20% of our lineups. That's below the projected field ownership, but it's still a relevant value piece. 13% at a $4,500 price for Davion Mitchell. Same deal. Low-end player overall. Low-end per minute guy at just 0.74, but very cheap across both guard spots. Kind of make things work in that ugly Miami-Orlando game. Between his low-end production and just the sub 260, I think it was a 215 point total, a little bit of, negative impact from those things. And that's why I would definitely prefer to be below the field like this. And honestly, that would be one I'd be willing to sacrifice. And if I could just straight line it to more shares of Najee Marshall or more shares at the guard spot of Trey Jones for a lower price, so be it. I'm fine with doing that. Angle this up a little bit more at the expense of that kind of works. Much better per minute guy. Much better game environment on Trey Jones. So I like that despite the minutes disparity. I think that would be the way to approach that. But Davion Mitchell's in play. Looking down the board further here, a lot of onesie-twosie shares. It's a big slate, so all these guys are coming up in a handful of lineups. Skipping through some of these guys, Keontae George, Mikal Bridges, all fine. Julian Champagny, mix and matchy type value guy with a low total, mediocre 0.84 per minute on DraftKings. None of those guys came up as overly relevant on FanDuel. We do have a standout Ja Morant on the FanDuel board. Only 8,300 for Ja over there. Creates a 5.4 value score when we're only looking for 5. Significant. 38% of our lineups, he's over the field there, only, gradually over the field, but it looks like Ja and Trey Young together. Trey Morant, mash them together. Who cares? The Trey Morant play looks pretty solid. between those two guys, 49% of Trae Young and 38% of John Morant. And then you have another guy highly owned down here in 48% KPJ, looking pretty decent. 5,600 is not a bad price for a 1.10 player. We'll see what he looks like this year, but that's where he was last year. Solid, nearly 25% usage. It's not bad. On DraftKings, he's 6,500. He only hits the board 5.3% of the time. He got into some lineups, but kind of as a just rotation guy. Nothing wrong with CJ McCollum, nothing wrong with Devin Booker, who could stand taller than he's projected here on his own out there in Phoenix. 8% on FanDuel below the field, 5% on DraftKings. Would not stun me if Book put up a 50-point game on either side, though. Stephon Castle, no real love. Anthony Edwards, assuming he plays, perfectly fine. This is another guy, ceiling player. You can absolutely take additional shares of Anthony Edwards. The one thing I'll say here is this game at the end of the night against Portland, I think gets a little unexpectedly grindy, or at least maybe the DFS community isn't really accounting for how grindy that game's going to get and how good that Portland team's going to be defensively this year. So I think 6% and being below the field on Ant, perfectly comfortable. I don't mind him at that price, though. That is a good price for Ant. 994 on FanDuel works, but 9,000 on DK. Point guard and shooting guard eligible. I like that spot. I just don't like I like that price for that player. I just don't like that matchup overall. But again, taking additional shares of him, perfectly fine, because the field's going to be 12, 15%. So you can get out to that level and be perfectly fine on a player like that. We can get much LaMelo on the other side of that Brooklyn game. We actually, in fact, got none on FanDuel at a 4.58 value score. 4.74 of Scotty Barnes. We only got a couple of shares. Both those guys projected over 40 points. They're both excellent players, but just not great situations on an incredibly large slate. If you end up with a few shares of either one of those guys, though, you're perfectly fine on FanDuel. It's not a disaster that you have to rush and change just because you got 2 shares in your 20 lineups or 150 lineups or whatever it is. On DraftKings, they hit the board a little bit more impactfully. 476, 483 value score. Again, both over 40 fantasy points. Just a handful of shares of each guy, though. They're just in the mix for shares with all of these guys that are coming up just a little bit. Everybody's playable. James Harden, 27% is significant on FanDuel. That is below the field. Noteworthy that it's below the field while still being a fairly large number. He's completely different at 91 on DK. He's an $8,300 FanDuel player. At 91 on DK, we're getting him 4% and hard undercut to the field. But even with that, the field's probably only 12, 18, somewhere at a top end. Feels more aggressive on him as a better buy on the FanDuel site. Grayson Allen, I'm not in love with the player, but 5.98 value score probably shouldn't be ignored. Over 30 minutes at just 4,300 shooting guard and small forward eligible. We got him 38% of the time. The field is aggressively there, though. He is under the field at 38% FanDuel exposure. For me, give me James Harden a little bit ahead of that if I can get there. That's a dramatic price difference, though. But I'm looking at some of those either star caliber guys like Ja, like Trae Young, up the board at higher prices to fill those spots. Or if I'm looking for value, that's where we can probably slot in some KPJ at a not completely dissimilar 5,600. You got to find it, of course. But for a very cheap 4,300, 0.82 per minute from Grayson Allen, reasonable. He's a guy who gets his hands on the ball. He's a low usage guy, but he comes through with some fantasy scoring. Jordan Clarkson, decent value score. Not really getting into any lineup shares at a 24-minute projection. That's somebody who could outplay that minutes projection. Don't really know what the Knicks are going to look like. For one, they're missing some pieces. They brought in a number of solid guys to round out that rotation and really deepen that squad, like Jordan Clarkson, like Yabu, who I mentioned earlier in the show. But kind of up in the air about what these are going to look like with new coaching. Mike Brown instead of Tibbs this year probably has an impact on the top end as well. We're probably not going to see Mikal Bridges grind out 43-minute nights on the second night of a back-to-back like Tibbs did. So different Knicks squad, different usage expected, or different approach expected with how these guys are going to be deployed in the rotation. 4,900 for Clarkson on the DraftKings board gets him into 2% of lineups. Perfectly playable on either side. Does have a reasonable value score on either side. Could go north of these numbers, but also has a little bit of a basement as well. Nobody of much relevance on this side of the board. Onesie, twosie shares of any of these guys. A little bit more impactful for some of them on FanDuel. We talked about Grayson Allen. 4% of RJ Barrett, just a mixer today at an okay price. 2% of Dyson Daniels, another guy, premium player who can bend slates on those days where he comes up with 6-7 steals. Definitely changes things, and just a better overall player than maybe he gets credit for. 7,300 is not a bad price, but it doesn't really create value. 4.73 value score, 2% on maybe a different slate. That's a better spot. We did get some VJ Edgecombe, 17%. We're level with the field there. 30-minute projection, 4,600 small forward shooting guard eligible. He's a $5,000 DraftKings player. We got 1.3% across 150 lineups. Just a little bit of a mixer. That's below the field, but not aggressively so. But looks like a much more interesting FanDuel play. 5.5 value score should get some time there with that messy Philly squad. So definitely an interesting spot. Peyton Pritchard coming up a little bit, but below the field. 5+ value score for him. Reasonable upside, good player, but not a slate breaker. Just looks like, is who he is, kind of a spot at a probably correct 5,500 for Peyton Pritchard. So not really seeing that standing out too much. Maybe it's a little cheap. Maybe 58 would be more appropriate. 6,000 maybe. Little bit of value there. He is above the value score, so you got to give him credit for that. He's probably on 15, 18% by the field, but being below, I think, makes a little bit of sense. Karis LeVert, always a reasonable mixer. Herb Jones hit the board a little bit. We've got some guys hiding down here too because this slate is gigantic. 22% of Jordan Poole, who I'm not a huge fan of, but 6,200, reasonably appealing for the 5.36 value score. We got none of him at 4.49 value for 7,800. Just a guy that goes the other way. Cheaper on FanDuel by a pretty wide margin to create some upside, create some positioning and value. We are above the field. Not crazy aggressively so. Certainly not as much as we are on Quentin Grimes. 27.9 point projection in 30 minutes. It's about right. 0.98 per minute player last year. Why are we so high above the field? 6.20 value score. It's only 4,500. I'm surprised. Bear with me one sec. I want to check what that FanDuel ownership number is. Not somebody we really need to spend that much time on, but if he's coming up like that, maybe we do. I just have them for radically different minutes than they do? I don't think so. I have for 1 additional minute, but 3.5 additional fantasy points. I think our pals over at the site where the ownership comes from are maybe giving Boston a little undue credit for defense that they're not necessarily going to have this year. Yeah, my 27-point projection on Grimy here is a 0.93 per minute. So that is actually giving Boston a little bit of credit. It's taking a 0.05 per minute off of Grimes and what he did last year. That's just a good value score. 4,500. He's coming up in half of lineups on the FanDuel slate. That's kind of an interesting differentiation point. We got none of him for 7,000 on the DraftKings board. You can see the difference across sites. 7,000 on DK, 45 on FanDuel. Dramatically different. DiVincenzo, again, this is before I gave him 2 additional minutes, and he came up at nearly 15%. Maybe gets a little bit more interesting at 4,500. Another very cheap option on the FanDuel board. 0.94 per minute, a good player who can get his hands on the ball defensively, who can make some threes and kind of run a fantasy score up a little bit. Probably not going to be on a ton of people's radar. He's level with the field at 15, but that value score tells me we can get to a little bit more Devo and probably will as we goose that projection for officially being confirmed to start ahead of Conley. 11% of Ace Bailey. Meh, take it or leave it. Didn't come up at all on DK. At 5,900 on DraftKings, yeah, that's why. 3.72 value score. No reason to play him there. 537 on FanDuel, though. Definitely gets into the mix for at least a few shares. That's all I'll say about that. Handful of Sam Merrill. Nipple. I legitimately don't know how to say that name. Khan? Like Wrath of? Is the K is silent? Is it on Nupel? I'll find out tonight. KCP, mix and matcher. Nothing really there. Let's jump to forwards. And we got to pick up the pace a little bit here. Hockey projections are live on the site. Fortunately, we only had a 3-game hockey slate to deal with today. So nothing too crazy over there. At one point, I was debating leaving them for after this show, but I'm glad I didn't. Game 1 of the World Series on Friday. We'll have full projections for that, and through the series, we'll have full projections for Thursday night football, for the weekend main slates, for Monday night football, Sunday night football, everything you need, all 4 major sports, rocking and rolling over at rotoscouts.com for under $1 a day, all the time, for access to all of it, not per sport, all of it, under $1 a day. Weekly, monthly, and quarterly plans available, and on a new weekly plan, promo code WEEKFREE gets you your first week for free. All right. We already addressed at the top of the show, but if you weren't here, PJ Washington is a free square, and you should absolutely be playing him today. Do not make the mistake of taking PJ Washington out of your pool, ignoring him, considering him not a good value. Do not make the mistake of thinking that he's too chalky, too popular. That is a free spot. You should absolutely take advantage. There's a very, very good chance that we don't see better than that 9.77 value score all season long. Swoosh bang, what's going on? Yeah, NBA, eh? Yeah, buddy. You're from Canada? I say all the time. I don't know if I just eventually adopted it from Canadians and like mocking the A. I think The Simpsons is probably an influence on that from back in the day, but yeah, that's a regular part of my vocabulary. Anyway, good to see you. Michigan, all right. Yeah, you get some of that up there too. Good to see you, bud. But yeah, basketball. We'll be doing this pretty much every day for shows, content, projections every single day. So PJ Washington, free square on DraftKings, totally irrelevant on FanDuel at 6,100. That is the correct price for PJ Washington. That's a 0.99 DraftKings player, 0.99 FanDuel last year. That is a good enough player. I've got him at 30 minutes tonight. Maybe he plays 28 and dips a little bit. He could play 22 at that price and still be a really good value. Zion, love on both sides. 155 on DraftKings, 156 on FanDuel. Monster upside in that spot against Memphis. This is against a 33-minute projection. He could play another 2-3 minutes beyond that on the right night. Probably doesn't on opening night, but definitely major upside, even if he plays a little lighter. 5.5 value score, 5.77 across sites. AD, looking like a beast on DraftKings and easy to afford. Given all the value spots, all the free squares we've got, including PJ, there's nothing wrong with loading up on some stars like AD, like Zion. AD comes up 36%, essentially half the ownership that we got Zion at, and level with the field. I think that makes sense given the $800 price difference between the two. On FanDuel, we got 86% of the time because he's 10.9 compared to the 93 that Zion costs. We've got better values to use among the big men. That said, if you want to take AD up to 10, 12%, that 6% is level with the field. So like we talked about with KD yesterday on the smaller slate, when you see star caliber ceiling type players at just low mid single digit type ownership, and you just say, all right, just because of who that is, let me double that just to take the ceiling spot. Nothing wrong with that. You sacrifice 12% of your lineups if it doesn't work out. Nothing wrong with that. In one lineup, it's not the mathematically correct decision to make necessarily, but in 6% of our 150 it was. So that justifies using it in one lineup, and for that one lineup, it would be a very differentiated choice to make while still going to a major source of scoring. So I don't mind that even with the 6% light returns in sim. 36% on DraftKings is a high priority start. Sorry, Williams didn't come up at all on FanDuel because he's at 4,000 over there, and he's a fairly useless player. 0.85 FanDuel points per minute on league average, 18% usage last year. He's another guy, 3,000 on DraftKings, just a free spot. Just booking 24 minutes of NBA play from essentially anyone for 3,000 is worthwhile. Came up in 35% of our lineups across 150. Level with the field, 6.58 value score is significant, but it pales in comparison to where we get PJ at, and PJ's got that small forward value or positioning. So between the two, it's PJ every time, but you can actually use probably both of them together, and we probably have a fair number of lineups that did, given the exposure that we got to Zaire Williams. Cat, major piece on both sides, and we're above the field, assuming he plays. I'm probably leaning at this point in the day toward Cat doesn't end up going and screws up this whole board. But if he's there, it's a great spot for him. Great spot for upside. Still no news. Luka practiced today. That's good news. Alex Caruso got placed in the concussion protocol, and that's why you don't overplay Alex Caruso on opening night. We talked about that yesterday. Paulo Banchero looking like a Paolo spot. Pretty solid at just 8,200 on DraftKings. He's 89 on FanDuel. It impacts the exposure that we got, 4% level with the field on FanDuel. Another guy, no issues though. There's ceiling there. You can take a few additional shares and get beyond the field on Paulo if you want to on the FanDuel board. 26% level with the field. That's a more difficult proposition on DraftKings. You probably just take the shares essentially level with the field around that area. It's a perfectly good play though. 5.19. That's closing in on our value threshold for a guy who creates ceiling. Najee Marshall, we talked about already, but 3,600, another very cheap guy. We got him 20% and less than the field on DK. Didn't get him at all on FanDuel. Yabu becomes probably a priority at 3,800 small forward, power forward if Cat doesn't go. 6.0 value score already. Got him into 19% of lineups on DK, but that is below the field. On FanDuel, we got him at 0. 4,700 over there. Power forward only has an impact. The price, the additional price has an impact. But if he goes up a little bit by projection, at least some onesie, twosie shares, I wouldn't expect him to get rocket up the FanDuel board, but he would gain some ground on DK at that $3,800 price. That would become an interesting value. You can position him at power forward with PJ at small forward. You put them both at either one of these small forward, power forward spots, obviously. And it maybe boxes out some of those only middling type Zaire Williams value shares. You're spending a little bit more to get there, but you've got the shared positioning. And you've got the generally what would be a higher projection and a markedly similar value score if it changes. Ariel Porty would also hit the board from wherever the hell he is right now. Giannis is Giannis. You can absolutely take more than 8% and a hard undercut to the field on Giannis. 14% hard undercut to the field. Very, very expensive at 11.9, 11.1 across sites. Power forward only on FanDuel. Has the center eligibility to go with that on DraftKings. A little bit more valuable to the DraftKings board at a 5.3 value score. 4.93, but it's Giannis, one of the biggest ceiling players in the entire league, and he's going up against Washington. So major matchup, plenty of upside there, and could bend the slate too as well. Terrence Mann, OG Anunoby, and Julian Champagnie, we didn't really get it all on FanDuel. 8-9% shares on DraftKings, slightly below the field on each of those guys. Pair of value guys and a mid-board $6,000 OG. OG is a reasonable player, 0.89 per minute last year. Should see similar utility and upside days to what he had last year. Good defensive player, can make the three, good spot, 3-and-D type player. But not their go-to guy as far as usage goes. He's the third, fourth option in the offense, 19.5% usage rate last year, and a couple usage monsters. It's another guy who could pick up some offense, though, if Cat comes off the board. Kawhi Leonard, solid mixer on either side, but we're below the field on both. 12% on FanDuel, 6% on DraftKings, kind of the reverse of Giannis. Lower end guy, obviously, 118 per minute, 119 on DraftKings. Still puts him above a 5 on both sites in terms of value. That gets him where we want him on the FanDuel slate, why he's more popular over there. But we are undercutting the field on both sites. Less value at the 5.01 DraftKings value score, but not irrelevant. Buzelis, really interesting on FanDuel, 5.47 value, puts him clearly on the board, 18% level with the field. Wouldn't mind being like 25% and ahead of the field. That is a good player. 0.91 per minute last year, upside, highest scoring game environment on the board. 5.05 value score on the DraftKings slate, 5%, a little bit below the field. I wouldn't mind pushing that up to like 10, get a little bit of level with the field, maybe grab a slight advantage, but that's a good spot, good player in a good game. Scotty Barnes, one of the stars coming out of that high-end Toronto-Atlanta game environment. That said, just 2% on the FanDuel slate, 4.6 on the DraftKings board. We talked about Scotty because he's got point guard eligibility on DraftKings, so we already went through that. But just kind of a mixer, like a lot of these guys. Jalen Tyson, Trey Murphy, mix and matchy. We're getting down to the point already where we're just talking about onesie, twosie shares on the DraftKings side. But a lot of them, a lot of these guys landed in at least one lineup. You certainly don't want to ignore Jalen Johnson, Kristaps Porzingis on that Atlanta team now. Evan Mobley, certainly serviceable against the Knicks. Brandon Ingram for Toronto, definitely interesting. Bam from that ugly Miami-Orlando game. Perfectly playable. On DK, though, everybody was 4% or lower and slightly below the field. On FanDuel, some of those guys are a little bit more relevant. We got 21% of Mobley because he's only 7,900 over there. That's below the field, but it is above our value threshold. So is 5.21 for Jalen Johnson. So is 5.14 for KP. 6%, 12% for those two players out of Atlanta, both below the field, but both mixers at worst with a little bit of ceiling potential. Ingram came up level with the field at 2%, not overly relevant, but 16% level with the field on Bam is an interesting spot. 8,000 over there, center and power forward eligible. Not a bad option, 1.16 FanDuel points per minute, just a terrible game environment, and there's some quality bigs on the other side of that one. So I don't love Bam, and if I had to make a choice, 4.81 value, I probably undercut where we're at in that sim on the FanDuel board. 16%, give me 10, give me 12, even 8, and I'm okay there. Could hurt me, but I don't really see it happening. Not in that game. Middleton, 4% FanDuel. Edgecombe, we talked about already, coming up a little bit on the FanDuel board at a cheap price. Franz Wagner on the other side of the Miami-Orlando game. Again, just an ugly game environment, not really pushing anybody, but 9.3% of him, not irrelevant. Karis LeVert, we talked about already, but again, 9% of him at 5.47 value, not bad. Triple J down the board on FanDuel. Doesn't look like we got to him on DraftKings. And not really relevant. 4.57 value score for 86 on DK. He's 7,700 on the FanDuel slate. Power forward and center eligible. 1.28 points per minute. Definitely interested there. 18%. Wouldn't mind having 22 to 25%, honestly. Take a little bit of upside against the field. It's a very good player. We could see a few additional minutes. 34 in a competitive game wouldn't surprise me. Monster shares a Cooper Flag on FanDuel. Expected to start small forward, power forward, 6,000. Definitely puts him on the value board at a 5.95 value score. On DraftKings, totally irrelevant. He's 7,400 over there. Didn't hit the board at all. Same positioning. Literally got 0 shares. Below the field because the field's probably at like 5, but that is not a good-looking play on DraftKings. Dramatically different across sites. I believe he was the highest owned FanDuel projected player, which I don't know if I agree with totally. But yeah, he was our highest owned in the public ownership, the highest owned FanDuel player. What was that number? Yeah, so to put this in perspective, our gentle angle up on the green number there, the field's at like right around 50%. So we got 9-10% additional on Cooper Flag here. Should be a good enough spot. Might be a little aggressive on that projection. But with some missing pieces, I can see it. 6,300 on Azar Thompson is really interesting on FanDuel. Excuse me, 63% at 5,400. He's a $6,800 small forward only on the DraftKings slate. Take advantage on FanDuel. 112 per minute last year. Tremendous. And again, a game we want to get to. And I like the Detroit side of that one. That's a 30-minute projection. He could play a few additional minutes and blow past this. 6.10 makes him one of the best value scores on the day on FanDuel. 63% and aggressively ahead of the field on Azar Thompson. Santiago Aldama, solid mixer, 25% level with the field. 6% of Kelly Oubre level with the field on FanDuel. None of those guys came up at all on DK. 11% on Ace Bailey. Again, not a huge spot for me, but definitely clearing the value threshold technically on FanDuel. Royce O'Neal, 5%. Nobody else looking overly relevant down there. Let's jump to centers. Towns and Huckporty starting? Huh, okay. Yeah. Per underdog, Cat, barring unforeseen circumstances, Purry and Begley is active. And Huckporty, not Yabu, going to start in place of Mitch. So that's an interesting little twist. I was kind of expecting the Cat Yabu starting unit. It'll definitely impact Porty. Yeah, see, I just had Porty at 10 minutes. I don't know that that's going to be more than like a 16-minute type start. Like Yabu off the bench is going to be a significant factor there. They can play him and Cat side by side. And I'm more interested in Cat at the 5. I think that impacts Cat, honestly, a little bit. Which is interesting. But yeah, that'll change a little on Hook 40, but I don't think it's going to be enough to put him really on the value board, even at 3,000 on DraftKings. Keep an eye out where it lands. But I don't think we're going into like PJ Washington territory, anything remotely close. Hook 40 is just not that guy. Also 0.69 per minute, hustle, defense, rebounds type of a player. But yeah, maybe a little impact to Cat more than anything else. I don't think it actually impacts Yabu all that much for where I had him, I think 28 minutes. Maybe I bumped it to 30 at one point, but I could still see that. Looking down the board though, all the centers are here. All right, so we do get Cat. I like that. We're above the field slightly on both sites, 22% on FanDuel, 32% on DraftKings. We talked about AD already. Love that spot. Ryan Kalkbrenner is coming up a little bit. He's 3,200 on DraftKings. We're level with the field at 26%, 576 value score. It's a sub 20-point projection, something to bear in mind. At 3,700 on FanDuel, we did not get him at the singular center spot. We got him at 1.3% across 150. Not overly relevant over there. Radically different 10-6 for Joel Embiid on FanDuel. Didn't get him at all. $8,700 for Joel Embiid on DraftKings. We got a fairly significant share of him, 16%, a little bit more than that, but also below the field. Field's probably in like the 22-25% range there. If you want to level off an $8,700 Joel Embiid against a greatly diminished Boston squad, be my guest. 5.23 value. There is major ceiling there for that price. No issues at all with going to Embiid and just putting him into the mix, especially because you can get these guys at forward. So just like those two plus Embiid plus Zion, can you make all that work? Power forward, center, util, and forward. I think you can. I don't know if it works price-wise because you got a PJ in there at small forward and probably another of the $3,000 guys. But there's multiple angles for upside for guys like this with Joel Embiid coming in at 8,700. That's a 1.42 DraftKings points per minute player last year. Wemby, 10-9. Love to have him. Not a ton of room for him with some of these other guys outpacing him, but a guy who can absolutely break the slate, and we're going to see some stupid performances out of Wemby this year. Just 5x5s, quadruple doubles, everything is in play. Things we've never seen before are in play with this player. Just ridiculous. If you missed it, Boban the other day was pretty funny saying, I'm 7'7" and I have to look up to look him in the eye when I'm talking to him. Boban saying he thinks he's 7'9", 7'10". Just ridiculous. Unfathomable upside on any given slate. Already one of the best fantasy producers in the league. 164 per minute last year. There's a perfect comparison next to him. Giannis put up 168 last year. 161, 169 on DraftKings. Yeah, there's a difference, but Wemby's going to close that gap in an awful hurry. Nick Claxton, 2% of Jock Landale, 6% of KP on FanDuel, 9, 6, and 3% of each of those guys on DraftKings. Nobody overly relevant. On DraftKings, that's your group. You can throw maybe Nick Claxton into that mix because he's almost 10%. Maybe the $4,000 Jock Landale shares get in there a little bit, but everybody outside of that group is not hitting the board at all. And that includes Vooch. It includes, as we talked about, Triple J, Jalen Duren, Zubac, Jared Allen, Mark Williams. There's some players here. There's some guys drawing decent enough projections, but not really hitting it in the value column. Not getting into some sims. 1-2 shares of any of those guys, perfectly fine. As a differentiator, any of those guys, particularly the guys that are well above 1.0 fantasy points per minute. And again, there are a lot of guys, 127, 126, 131 for 7,800 from Mark Williams last year. There are producers down here, but there's just so much value up here that's getting soaked up and taking up all of our shares on this big slate. Depending on how you want to approach it, you can choose to mix some more of these guys in, put your thumb on the scale a little bit, differentiate, get away from some of the heavy ownership there, and put some of it into there. I wouldn't do that too dramatically, though. All of these guys look like pretty great plays. If you're doing that, honestly, per the Sims, the spots to do it on are probably these two, unfortunately, Wemby and Giannis, at their just very high prices and where we got them relative to the field. Take Giannis further down, put it into some of these guys who aren't coming up for field ownership either if you're going to do that. On the FanDuel side of that equation, it's kind of similar through a lot of those guys. Bam, as we talked about, is coming up a fair amount. Mobley at 21%. We're below the field, but that's an interesting spot. Solid projection, 7,900, not a bad price. Power forward and center eligible, 538 on the value board. That's a reasonable upside piece going up against the Knicks, but we know now that the Knicks are going to be basically full strength among the bigs at least. Miles Turner, 5% share, level with the field. A solid 5.31 value score there on Milwaukee now. We'll see what that looks like. But 6,300, not a bad price. A 1.07 per minute guy on 20% usage last year. We'll see what that comes in. It's probably going to be about the same. Would surprise me, really, if we saw a downgrade. Could see a little bit of an upgrade in this role. Kessler not on the board. John Collins not on the board really on either site. 1% over here. One share apiece over here. Lively, Saric, no. 18% though of Triple J. We talked about that already in the forwards, but again, that's a really interesting player. 128 per minute in a good game environment. 7,700, not a bad price. 517 value score. Jalen Duren does come up a little bit on FanDuel. $6,800 center, again, out of that appealing game environment against Chicago. 8%, but below the field. I think that's about right. 1.23 per minute. We get a lot of games from Duren. I've got him at 29 minutes. If you crested him over 30 into like the 31, 32 range, which he's capable of doing, that's when he becomes an interesting player because he can put up points per minute, no doubt about it, and that's a cheap price among the upside centers. But you get those down days out of Duren a lot where the minutes don't quite land where we need them. And I think that's a good reason to keep him at that 29-minute threshold right now. Zubac at the same 29 minutes, though, didn't come up. Illustrates the difference between the two players. 6% of Day'Ron Sharpe further down for 4,100. That's across just 18 minutes. There's not a ton of upside there, but that's a little bit lighter than the field. Good per minute player. That Brooklyn team is really messy, too, so that could easily turn into 24 minutes and become a lot more interesting in a hurry. But we don't really know what it looks like. Difficult to project right now. 2% of Drew Eubanks, 22-minute projection. Nobody else really hit the board at all. I think that about wraps it up. It's always so like, at the end of a basketball show because we're talking about like the worst guy at the worst position at the end of a basketball show. Usually I've got like home run picks and baseball, and like we're getting into that last game. It's still a good game. A lot of times it's like the Dodgers or whoever. Doing it this way when you're going position by position, and maybe if we're going game by game. But yeah, we got some updating to do. It is 5:30 on the dot here. Under an hour to get through the various positions. Not a lot of questions, not a lot of jibber jabber in the chat today. 26 people out there hanging out watching. I know there's big shows going on. I am going to try and get this earlier into the afternoon. Just the afternoon completely fell apart around getting the projections done in the first place today. But now that we've got the foundation pretty well set, it'll be easier to go from there. So look for the show, in the hopefully 3 to 4 hour rather than like 4:40, 4:35, 4:40. But hopefully it'll be a little earlier in your day going forward. Any questions, hop into the Discord. Free Discord should be linked in the description of this video below. Come join the community, hang out. You don't need to be a subscriber. I don't remember saying his name at all, House. Let's see where he is. Probably got to put everybody on the board first. He got into one DraftKings lineup at 53. 4.65 value score. I'm assuming that's where you're playing. If you're on FanDuel, he doesn't look overly relevant at 52. Didn't make it into a lineup. 4.51 value score. I got him in a 26-minute projection in the rotation on for Charlotte. It's kind of an ugly overall game. Right, what is that one coming in? Yeah, 228.5. I don't love that spot. 116.75 implied total, but more mouths to feed like above him. So I think he's a playable guy, but not necessarily like a useful guy, if that makes sense. Just in the mix for a share or two across 150. If he's a choice in any given lineup, it's fine. It's just a spot filler, but make sure you're not sacrificing something, significantly more value through that square. Yeah, he'll probably be the best player on the floor while he's on the floor in that ugly game. Definitely no argument there. And he's a good overall player. I just think there's not quite enough meat on the bone on such a large slate. If this was like, that was part of last night's slate, that would be an interesting guy that we probably would have talked about a little bit more. Otherwise, gang, hit that like and subscribe. Grab a free week with promo code WEEKFREE over at rotoscouts.com. Gets you behind the scenes for all 4 major sports right now through next Tuesday or next Wednesday. That gets you multiple football slates, basketball, NHL, a couple of World Series games along the way. Renews at regular price, but regular price for all 4 sports, all in under $1 a day. Weekly, monthly, and quarterly plans available at rotoscouts.com. Thanks to our guys at acemind.io for the sim tools. Check out acemind.io. Pretty sure promo code rotoscouts all in caps still gets you 20% off of a month over there. Great spot for sims, optimizer, multiple sports in play, and very, very good price points for what you get. Bang for your buck over there. Let me punch out of here, guys. Let me, how's saying I like Drew to hound Dante DiVincenzo tonight? Yeah, I just think I have a healthier amount of respect going into the season for what that Portland team's going to look like defensively. So, yeah, I'm with you. I think they grind that Minnesota squad down, and that game just is a little bit overrated, I think, with where some of those guys are coming up. Not that they're rocketing to the top of the board necessarily, but I don't think it's a great Devo spot, even though he comes up a little bit and is going to probably pick up a little bit of projection for starting. I don't think it's a great Ant spot, but would play him as we talked about through. But, yeah, grindy game toward the end of the night there. Let me punch out, guys. We'll get an update through in the next couple of minutes. We'll be on top of news going all the way up to lock and beyond. Every piece of news that comes out, I'll try and document for you on the site as changes are made through the projections. It's something I try and provide. If you haven't caught that yet, I try and give you all right, this is what changed that you got to look for. So if you don't have that guy or you didn't have anything positioned around it or it doesn't necessarily create value, you don't necessarily need to worry about it at 9:30 tonight. So I try and give you those pieces of information when the updates drop. But stay tuned. Another one, big update will be coming through in the next 20 minutes or so. Let me get through everything and catch up. Really appreciate all you guys. You are released. Go join those other big shows that are going on and see what those guys are talking about. I'm sure there's some good info going through those. But yeah, absolutely rock. Good luck out there tonight. Somebody go win something. Share those results when you do. And come on back tomorrow for more. Later, gang.